What's up guys, Maxim here back again with another Academy FM tutorial, and this tutorial is going to take you through all there is to know about the essentials of compression with Ableton 10, or in Ableton 10 with the stock plugins. So we're going to be using the glue compressor, which is a fairly faithful emulation of the classical G-Bus SSL series compressor, the bus compressor. And I believe, this is by Cytomic or Cytomic or something like that. That's what the company's called that made this emulation that Ableton adapted. And we've also got the standard compressor. So this isn't an emulation of anything. It's just a compressor. It literally does what it says. It compresses signals. And of course, that's not all to it. You can set different you can set it up in different ways to get different sounds or make it work in a different manner. And finally, we've also got the multiband dynamics, and this is Ableton's multiband compressor. Personally, not one of my favorite multiband compressors ever. I wouldn't use it personally for anything high grade as mastering, especially if I master other people's songs. I mean, generally, when you're trying to get the highest quality out, even if it's just a 5-10% difference, you might as well at that stage, right? So I prefer something like a linear phase multiband compressor or something which gives me a bit more of a better overview of what's happening and just more options in general. But I think that in terms of production and overall sound design and using multiband compressors to get a sound, this compressor is great. I like using it, especially some of the presets are really awesome, like the OTT. I mean, despite Extra Records having the OTT as a free plugin as well, this just works just as fine. I love using that for sound design or at a slow, at a very, let's say, at like 10% or 20% on a sound to beef it up or bring out more reverbs or something like that. So that's a cool little interesting overboard effect that you can use. And I like the typical multi-band compression preset if I do use it on a mix bus, as I will here. And in general, as multi-band dynamics or compressors go, it just offers you more functionality in the sense that you can attack different parts of the frequency spectrum with different forms of compression, right? So it's, in a sense, similar to the EQ3, where you've got 3 different frequency bands and you're basically processing them with compression in their each own way differently. So we're going to actually go ahead and start off with the mix bus here, and we're going to be experimenting around with the multiband dynamics. So let's go ahead and grab this preset right here, since that tends to work fairly well for me when I do use it. And we're also going to load up the glue compressor. So let's go ahead and disable that. We'll go into that in a second. And let's just play around with the multiband compressor and see what that's doing so far to this in general. Let's make sure that we're also enabling the other tracks. Let's go ahead and listen to this. So this isn't exactly doing everything that I would want a multiband compressor to do, but in terms of as far as this preset goes, the reason I like using it because I don't have to usually do as much in the attack and release range, since it doesn't choke my low end or it lets transients pass, but I don't like the release settings on this preset. So we're going to go ahead and take this down and mess around with this. So especially for the low end, I want to take this down to something like 40. I also want to bring the attack down just a bit so it can latch onto that signal quicker. And the reason I'm bringing the release down is because just in a regular compressor, just as it is here, let me demonstrate here, more to say, is the faster the release is, the less the compression is going to linger around for the period that it is compressing. And the attack, for example, is the shorter the attack is, the faster the compression hits, whereas the longer the attack is, the more time the transients have to pass before the attack smacks on. And these aren't large differences either most of the time. It's a difference between, say, a millisecond or 30 milliseconds. And for releases, for example, as far as that goes, you can go down really ridiculous numbers, especially with other types of compressors, say FET style compressors. You can get really ridiculous and in the attack and release range in terms of what's possible there. And just the same way is the reason why we want to set attack and release settings properly, is because this enables us to shape the sound exactly how we want it. And part of that is letting the compressor latch onto the signal. So you don't want the attack to be something which is ridiculously high either. You want it to react to the sound. You want it to clamp onto the sound so it can do what it does, which is important for, say, a glue compressor. And you don't want the release to be too long in most instances either, because you don't want the compression to sit around all the time without moving properly, because especially in EDM music, you've got a lot of transients bouncing around oftentimes, and it's not like classical music where you've got a lot of sustained instruments where there's not much really happening in terms of transients a lot of the time. So we're going to go ahead and just take a quick listen to this. Also, maybe adjust the frequency ranges here to set that up to how exactly we want this. So let's go ahead and give that a listen. So now that I set the attack and release settings properly and have everything clamping on in terms of compression the way I want it, I went to the threshold and ratio settings. So this again is pretty balanced out. This is fine. I might take down the highs a bit more since I added just a slight bit, because I made sure that the attack of the high band is fairly fast, since I felt like in this track at least there are a lot of high frequencies going around, which I kind of want to just help suppress a bit, almost in the similar way as the ESO would work, but this is a lot more broad and less invasive, of course. And you can see that the ratios here are very, very soft. It's barely doing any compression for when it hits, and this for the mix bus is essentially ideal, but we're going to beef this up to a 2-to-1 ratio for the high end, or maybe even a bit higher, maybe to 3-to-1 or something like that, even though we don't want to put this too much out of balance. So let's put that at 2-to-1, and we're going to leave all of this the way it is, since I don't want this compression to be too invasive. And let's go ahead and just give that a final listen. So one thing I noticed is that the low end is a bit too compressed for my liking here, so I'm going to taper that back a bit, just a touch, and maybe boost it very, very slightly, just so that comes in nicely again. And that's pretty much it for that. And usually I don't have a lot of compression on a mix bus actually working as a compressor, so to say. I have it more in line with the characteristic of the compressor, just barely feeding enough volume into it so it can work. But in this case, we're going to also obviously showcase the glue compressor and set that up in a way that we like it. So this is the standard basically setup. This is a 4-to-1 ratio, a 2-to-1 ratio, and a 10-to-1 ratio. So as ratios go, the higher the ratio, the more it's going to act as a limiter, so to say. And of course, the less the ratio is, the less compression is actually done per when the threshold hits. So I find that a ratio of 4-to-1 tends to sound best on an SSL type compressor. And since we're in EDM, we don't want to choke the kick drum, so we're going to start at 30 milliseconds. In some cases where I feel like the kick drum might be a bit too loud or messing or just not letting everything groove properly and just peaking too much in the whole mix, I might take it down to 10 milliseconds, but usually you won't see me having a tack like this on, especially on a mix bus in EDM, since I'd just be choking the kick drum, and I'm going to show you what that sounds like right now, actually, as a matter of fact. But first of all, let's go ahead and set up our actual compression that we want, and we're also going to make sure to engage the clipping here. This is just going to prevent the volume that we might add with the makeup to make the whole track clip. So we're going to go ahead and dial in the release as we play the track, and then you can really hear how the compression becomes more focused and moves more with the music while I dial that in. So as you could see in the end, I showed you what having a super fast attack on the mix bus sounds like in EDM, and it's just the kick drum is completely choked. However, though, in a parallel compression scenario, this might actually be the preferred method, since you're really hearing the compressor work that way because it's clamping onto every transient. So if we go ahead and use this dry wet knob, and you can do this for any type of compressor, you can use it in parallel mode, especially for the multiband compression. If you want to go a bit more hefty on that end, you can use a dry wet signal to just mix a bit of that in, which I actually like doing. But in this case, I'm going to show you what having the compressor sound mixed in with the original signal on a parallel basically setting, that can also sometimes lead to results which are a bit more preferable than the latter. So let's go ahead and listen to that. So as you can see, once you match the volume properly, you're starting to really bring in a lot of that really extreme SSL sound. But as far as SSL bus compressors go, and this compressor goes, I just prefer having it, in most cases, completely wet, and just setting it up in a sense where I'm not really getting too much of that sound, because I can feel like it can be distracting, since it has such a present, almost like a sound where it's sucking on the sound, in a sense that it's really pumping. It's a pumping compressor, which is nice, but I don't like it to be too extreme. So let's go ahead and just listen to this setting right here. So here I'm really just letting the compressor do a lot of work, but I'm not really too extreme. With SSL compressors, I really don't push things further than the 4 dBs of gain reduction here, because I feel like that's when the compressor starts sounding really bad, at least to my ears. It's just too much of that sound. But again, in the genre you might be working in, or the way you're using it, in whatever type of music you're doing, you might find a different result more pleasing. So always make sure to gain stage everything properly, because if you don't have any makeup, anytime you disable the effect, since you're doing compression, it's going to sound quieter and therefore worse. So make sure that you set the makeup properly, that it's not just becoming louder, but that things are also sounding nicer, of course. And we're just going to go ahead and leave that there. Also, sometimes it's nice to mess around with the chain of compression. So having maybe this compressor first might sound better than having it here, and vice versa. You know, also in a sense, maybe me adding some makeup here is going to drive more volume into the multiband compressor, which is going to react here, which is going to help the sound react differently here. And again, these little mess arounds, in a sense, just doing these simple things, can evoke a different sound. And let's go ahead and take a quick listen to that quick chain, and then I'm going to just quickly, to finish off, jump into the standard compressor right here on the kicks and tops bus, to show you guys that most of the time when you're using compression, at least in a more extreme settings or not on a mix bus, that this compressor essentially will get you 100% where you want to go, and that you can even go a bit further and model, say, different types of vintage EQs. And with a utility, for example, you can really drive the input of this compressor and still get a sound out of that. And that you can be really creative with setting up different compressor chains yourself. I don't want to make this video longer than I have to, but I'm still going to go ahead and show you guys how to do that. So stick around for all of that in just a second. But just for the example of just how changing a chain might slightly alter a sound in terms of compression, that, you know, is still important. So let's go ahead and listen to that. So you can really hear how, especially when you're using things like gain to just push into compressors. I really love having utility knobs almost everywhere when I'm using compressors, for example, since just pushing more volume into a compressor is going to give you a really different sound, because just reducing the threshold is different than driving more volume into the signal. It makes compressors react in a different way. So that's something to definitely take into consideration when you're setting these types of things up. And as I mentioned, let's go ahead and quickly just listen to this real quick, and then I'll also show you what exactly I mean with setting up maybe some compression chains. So let's go ahead and take a quick listen to this right here. So as you can see here, the way I'm setting up this compressor is that I have a close to 3-to-1 ratio, which is the ratio I always use on an API 2500 compressor when I work with it on drums. I just find that for drums, this ratio just works for me, the way I set thresholds in my attack and release settings. There's just something about the way the sound reacts that just works for me. It's not killing the transients too much. It's not clamping on too much on any one given sound. And the way I set up the attack and release again is I'm letting enough of the transient pass to not choke my kick drum. And I have a relatively fast release as well to make sure that the groove is constant. As you could hear while I was enabling and disabling it again, is that everything just seems a bit more glued together in that sense. Everything seems a bit more glued together, and the kick seems almost a bit more focused as well. There's just a bit more life going on, and that's really what we like to do with compression, and what we focus on evoking is not only making things less dynamic, of course, which is important in the greater scheme of things when setting instrument levels and making sure that nothing is suddenly really loud and then very quiet the next. And on the other end, compressors can really also just add characteristic to your songs. And as always, you can really drive this stuff, and then you can go ahead and just taper that back. So what we're going to do is, especially if you set this up as a group, and you can go crazy with macros and all that. So let's go ahead and set this up as a group right here. And I can make a very specific, another tutorial, but just a quick demo right here. We're going to go ahead and drive a hell of gain into here. And again, with macros, you can automate this too. So we're just going to go ahead and drive a lot of that in, bring the attack down a bit more so we get a bit more of that sound, bring the release up just a touch. And let's go ahead and see what this is actually doing right here. So let's bring that down. Let's bring that down pretty much completely, or until it basically levels that out, and see what the way this is responding. Because essentially this is just basically a level match right here, right? Let's go ahead and see what this does. So this is just a quick demonstration right here. This isn't really invoking that much of a difference, but again, I'm going to definitely make a more in-depth tutorial on this, but this again offers you an ability to model certain types of compressors that you might not have, or just fun, quick ways to beef up a compressor sound or use it just more creatively. So I hope that gives you a nice overview of all the different ways of using compressors, and essentially the basics of how to use compressors and how you should go about thinking when using them, and that you've learned a thing or two.